I like my kids. Why are you giggling nervously like you're afraid of what I'm about to say? I like my kids, but I miss something about life BC, before Caleb. I miss Sunday afternoon naps. The kids do not understand how wonderful it is to eat way too much food at the Mexican restaurant and to come home when it's a beautiful fall day like this and you get in a chair by the window that's been a little bit warmed by the sun and the house is cool, and then you wake up and it was wonderful. My kids don't understand how wonderful the Sunday afternoon nap is, and I feel like a failure as a parent because of that. And the worst part of this for me is I come here on Sunday mornings and I watch you take a nap in church knowing I'm not going to get a nap this afternoon. Here you are, and here I am. That's why so many preachers are so cranky and there's so much hellfire and brimstone. You get a nap and we don't. There's something about rest that's good for us. Isn't it funny? In our house, when the kids are at school for the first few weeks of each school year, when they get home, they are so hyper. And it's that stage where they are fighting. They're tired. They don't look tired because they're running around like crazy and they're thinking of new ways to hurt themselves. But they're tired, and that's how tired shows. Tired is a strange thing. Last week we were in Hebrews chapter 3, and we dealt with a warning label text. It was a text that said, watch out, because if you are faithless, if your heart is wrong, if you don't trust God, you don't enter the rest. That's Hebrews chapter 3, verse 11, which quoted Psalm 95. And it's this heavy passage where God swears, they shall not enter my rest. Now, we read Hebrews 3, and intuitively we understand that not entering the rest was a bad thing. But we never actually spent time thinking about what that threat meant, what that rest is, what that idea is. And it turns out that rest in the Bible is a better concept maybe than you've realized. It's even better than what happens on a Sunday afternoon. Hebrews seems to think rest is awfully important. Did you know that the word translated rest in our text today only shows up in the Bible 9 times, and 8 of those 9 are in Hebrews 3 and Hebrews chapter 4. Here's our text, Hebrews 3:17. With whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? There's that line. But to those who were disobedient, so we see that they were unable to enter because of their unbelief. Now, the whole passage is saying they did not enter the rest. They missed the rest. Make sure you don't miss the rest. But if I ask most of you what the rest is, I'm not sure that your answer would be terribly helpful. I think the first answer you'd give me is kind of a really good Old Testament answer. It's a legitimate answer in a lot of ways. You'd tell me that rest was the promised land, right? You know, after the wilderness wanderings and the 40 years in the wilderness, we'd get finally to Canaan's land, the land flowing with milk and honey. We'd get to enter the land of rest. And that's part of the answer. But don't forget that the Bible very frequently likes to talk about 2 things at the same time. Sometimes it does 3 things at the same time. Remember that in the Bible, the people who misunderstood Jesus the most very frequently were the ones who paid attention to the obvious and didn't pay attention to the next level. You remember in John's gospel, in the ministry of Jesus, there is a woman at a well. Do you remember this story? And Jesus starts talking to her about water after which she'll never thirst again. And the only thing she can think of is asking Jesus about wells and buckets and how to drink this stuff. And Jesus says, you're missing the point. Same thing happened again in John chapter 3. Nicodemus is talking to Jesus. It's the middle of the night, and Jesus says, you got to be born again. And instead of Nicodemus realizing he was talking about something supernatural, he starts asking questions about how you go back in mama's belly, and this just sounds messy and it's not going to work. So make sure that you don't make that mistake when you read this text. I don't think this text is just talking about what happened when Israel made it to Israel. Now, a lot of us will do the Christian thing. We'll say, okay, I know we're not headed to a parcel of property in Palestine. I know we're Christians, but we still sing to Canaan's land, I'm on my way, and none of us are booking plane tickets on El Al. We think that we're going to the promised land, the other promised land. We think that the text is talking about heaven and the afterlife, and I think there's something there too. But can I tell you, I think there's actually something that's over and above both of these ideas in Hebrews 3 and Hebrews 4. Here's why I don't think that rest in these passages is just talking about the promised land in Israel or the promised land in the afterlife. Here's my 3 reasons. Reason 1, did you know that basically nowhere in the Pentateuch is the promised land described as a rest? Literally nowhere in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers, and maybe one passage in Deuteronomy, which might be looking back on it depending on what you think. In fact, nowhere really in the Gospels is heaven or the New Jerusalem referred to as rest. It happens a lot in our hymns, but not really a lot in Scripture. So that's something that should catch our ear. Number 2, in chapter 4, verse 8 of our text in Hebrews, the text said, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So Hebrews is saying the rest can't just be what happened at the end of the conquest of Canaan. It had to be in the future of that. So that takes off that one thing. And here's the 3rd reason. It's chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, and then verse 3, we who have believed have entered that rest. You take those texts and you realize that the rest is not just in the future, and the rest is not just in the past. The rest is in the present. Verse 7 makes it even more clear when it talks about entering that rest today. So the rest isn't Palestine, and the rest isn't the afterlife. There's something right now about this rest. It's not just talking about pie in the sky by and by when we die. It's talking about our experience in Christ today. Now, if that felt like a little rant about technicalities, hang on. The most important idea in Hebrews 3 and 4 is don't miss the rest. And most of us haven't even defined the word rest right. So what is the rest? Well, you know what rest is, don't you? It's a Sunday afternoon nap. It's different than death, right? Because, you wake up from the Sunday afternoon nap, all right? And music, what's a rest? Well, it's a beat where you don't do. where there's no music being played, where your part is silent. Well, what's a rest in sports? I guess we have timeouts. I guess, if you watch football, you get one every single play. If you watch soccer, you get one every 2 or 3 seasons, I guess. I don't know exactly what you want to use, but it's a break. It's a stopping place. It's a calm. It's a cessation. Verse 4 of Hebrews 4 reminds us of Genesis 2, verse 2. It says that God rested on the Sabbath from his works. And that idea turns out to be a big idea because in Exodus 20, it gets picked up in the story of the 10 Commandments to justify that commandment. But there's another passage that has always caught my ear. It's in Exodus 31:17. In this passage, it describes God on the 7th day resting and being refreshed. Now, that's kind of a weird verse for your theology because, I can understand God stopping. I can understand that part. But God being refreshed, that's an unusual idea, but it's a peace. It's a stillness. It's a stop. The work has been finished, so now I can enjoy the completed work. Keep that idea in your brain. Keep reading in Hebrews 4 and see if we can find more. In verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. You need to hear this verse again. Whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. I'm going to read this one more time because this verse turns out to be pretty important. Whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. This isn't talking about Palestine, and this isn't talking about the afterlife. Verse 3 says that believers have already entered the rest. So if you are a believer, if you are a Christ follower, by definition, the scripture says you are at rest. Why are you so tired then? Why are you so busy then? Go back to the story in the Old Testament that we looked at last week of those who missed the rest. What was their problem? It was a heart problem. It was a disbelief problem. There's one way of wording it that says they didn't trust that God would do what God said he would do. They were without water, and instead of saying, God, please save us like you did in times past, what did they do? They picked up rocks and they got ready to stone Moses. They tried to do for themselves. I want to make sure that you hear what I'm saying. When we do not trust God, it keeps us from rest. Because it forces us to, trust ourselves and try to accomplish the kingdom by our own means and by our own power. And that's when things go downhill quickly. When you trust God, you have rest. There was a terrifying scene in Exodus 14. This is actually kind of the opposite story of Exodus 16 and 17 that we talked about last week. It's a story right after Israel has fled from Egypt, right? It's the story where the Egyptian army is pursuing them and the Red Sea is about to be in front of them. And I hadn't noticed it until I was reading this week, but Exodus 14 verse 7 actually says that the army of Pharaoh overtook Israel. I'd missed that line. I always kind of pictured it where the army was right on their tails and they were getting close. But the text says that they were flanked. They were encompassed by the army and they were terrified, verse 10 says. So Israel cries out to God. And maybe you remember these lines. They said, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Now here's Exodus 14 verse 13. Here's what Moses says to a terrified people. "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today." How was Israel going to be saved? You hear it? God was going to do the saving. But the passage isn't even over yet. I've got to keep reading. God says, "For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to shut up." That's the Matthew translation. All you have to do is trust me. If you trust me, I will defeat them and you will be at rest. How did God defeat the army? Do you remember? Israel didn't win by picking up the sword. They rested. They trust God. The angel of God surrounded them in this fiery cloud. The breath of God divided the waters, and then the hand of God drowned the Egyptian army underneath the Red Sea. How was Israel saved? By God. They had to rest in that promise. It's funny. This is such a powerful idea, but it's such a hard idea for us. I have no doubt that at the Battle of Jericho, when Joshua and his men surrounded the city and they marched around, you remember 7 days and 7 times and the trumpets, I suspect that everyone understood when they blew the trumpets, it wasn't their act of trumpeting that delivered them. It was God who delivered them. Because they trusted God, they were able to be at rest. Because they trusted God, they were able to obey. Trust comes first. Whoever entered God's rest, whoever believes, remember, enters God's rest, also rested from his works as God did from his. Think about your busyness, your anxiety. Think about all the things that are keeping you up at night. What was the last time you couldn't sleep at night because you were turning over some situation? What's going to happen? How's my family? What's the direction of the country? What's this? The irony of that was you couldn't rest when you needed rest because you weren't resting in his promises. Trust God and you'll find rest. When someone hurts you, you can rest from the need for revenge if you know that God is in control. In Revelation 6, there's this cool line. John sees the martyrs, the people who died for their faith, and they cry out to God, "Oh God, sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood?" Here's God's answer in verse 11 of Revelation 6. They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little while longer. What a line. Rest. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. It's funny, this idea is simultaneously so appealing and so appalling to us. I like this idea so much. Isn't it wonderful to think when I'm laying in bed that I don't have to stay awake at night because God is the one who's running the universe, not me. Yet at the same time, you have to pry my fingers off of the steering wheel of the universe, don't you? I want the rest, but I don't want the rest. Trusting is so important. Hebrews 11 is going to go on to say, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Some of you experienced quarantine this year. Some of you are watching from home under quarantine right now, and you're supposed to stay home and you're supposed to rest, and it's driving you crazy because you feel like you have to be doing something. Rest. What store got busier than any other store during the quarantine, by the way? Lowe's. Lowe's. Why? Because when faced with the prospect of being home, we had to find something to do. God forbid we read a book and played with a dog. But we had to plant a garden, and we had to pressure wash the side, and we had to do something. Rest is so easy and so beautiful. Yet just like my kids at the end of a school day, you and I go kicking and screaming. I don't need it. I don't want to. I don't have to. You can't make me. I'm not tired. I'm not tired. Now, don't misunderstand this rest. Hebrews 10, verse 24, talks about the need to stir up one another to love and good works. I'm not talking about laziness. We have work to do. I've read the Bible. I know that sort of thing. But what I'm telling you this morning is if we are believers, our work is in His hands. He directs our steps instead of we directing His. Jesus calls us to trust Him. He invites us to enter His rest. That rest comes from knowing that it's on Him that I stand. I can rest when I understand that the future of America does not depend on me. I can rest when I understand that my standing with God does not come from my accumulation of the right number of heaven points. My rest comes from knowing that I am dressed in His righteousness alone. Jesus calls us to rest. Are you tired? Second service is always more tired than first service. The morning people come to first service. Same thing happens during the middle of the week in our Wednesday classes. The morning class on Wednesday are my retired people. They're just glad that they're still awake and alive. But when I get to the late class on Wednesday nights, it's the people who've been at work all day and been keeping kids all day. And sometimes I think the best thing I could do with a Wednesday night class is just turn off the lights for 30 minutes. I think it might save a life at some point. You're tired. Everyone's tired. I talked to Dan Calloway this past week. I wonder if he's watching, and I'm about to get some angry text messages. But he sounded tired. I don't miss having a newborn in the house. I'm sure glad those days are gone. What good news. We're all tired of the junk and the garbage and the stress and the worry. Should I have sent the kids to school? Should I have not? Did I prepare for retirement? Am I going to have enough money? What about my health? Who's got to go to the nursing home? Is he still mad at me? Life is exhausting if we live it in our strength. Maybe it's time to give up trying. Maybe it's time to rest. Augustine famously said that our hearts are restless until they find rest in Him. Thomas à Kempis prayed, "Give me above all desires the desire to rest in you, and in you let my heart have peace. You are true peace of heart. You alone are its rest. Without you, all things are difficult and troubled. In this peace, the self-same that's in you, the Most High, the everlasting good, I will sleep and take my rest." Here's another prayer from the late 1800s. "Lift up our souls, O Lord, to the pure, serene light of thy presence, that we may breathe freely, there repose in thy love, there be at rest from ourselves, and from thence return, arrayed in thy peace, to do and to bear what shall please thee for thy name's sake." The biggest mistake a person can make is not entering God's rest. This is one of those passages I've heard in church 1,000 times, but I never noticed it. Jeremiah 6. Jeremiah calls out to the people. He says, "Stand by the roads and look for the ancient paths. Find the ways that God designed for you and walk in it. And you will find rest for your souls." But what did the people say? You see it on the screen right behind me, don't you? They said, "Not gonna do it. Not gonna do it." Why would you refuse to rest? Well, I mean, when I talk about it in the pulpit and the sermon, it sounds pretty dumb, doesn't it? I mean, if you gave me an opportunity to take a nap right now, I would take you up on it right now. Why would people not rest? Well, I guess one reason is not understanding that they can. Another is Maybe they don't really fully and deeply trust the one who's watching over the rest. Maybe they don't understand. They have this bad thinking. Maybe they think that they don't deserve the rest or they can't afford the rest. You know, it's funny how all of us feel like we are irreplaceable. James Hinkle likes to say, drive by the cemetery and you'll see a place full of people who were irreplaceable, yet the world still moves on. What did Jesus say? Come unto me, all who labor are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Will you? Or won't you? In college, I remember pulling some all-nighters, those papers that had to get written. And, you know, you see the clock at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And, you know, it occurs to me that a lot of us live our lives in maybe an emotional or spiritual version of the all-nighter. I've got to watch everything all the time. I've got to get enough. I've got to be enough. I've got to do enough. I've got to work enough. I've got to. Instead, this morning, I call you to trust. Because when you trust, then you can rest. But I'll give you this warning as I close. If you don't trust, you will never have rest. Which will you choose? Let's stand and sing.